Detention Facility Omega-7 squatted on the surface of Titan-3 like a metal tumor, its imposing structure designed to contain the galaxy's most dangerous criminals in conditions that made escape impossible and hope a luxury few could afford. Sergeant Jake Morrison had been stationed at facilities like this for the better part of 5 years, but something about Omega-7 felt different, colder, more sterile, with security protocols that seemed designed to isolate prisoners from any human contact that might remind them they were still sentient beings. "Morrison, you're assigned to Block 7, Cell 847, announced Warden Hayes during the morning briefing, his voice carrying the kind of bureaucratic indifference that came from years of treating prisoners as inventory rather than people. "New arrival from the Altarian sectors. Classified as extremely dangerous." Jake accepted the assignment tablet, reviewing the sparse information available about his new charge. Subject 847. Female Altarian, approximately 23 standard years, convicted of sabotage against human military installations during the recent border conflicts. The file noted suspected telepathic abilities requiring constant psionic dampening, along with warnings about potential psychological manipulation and escape attempts. "What kind of sabotage?" Jake asked, though he knew better than to expect detailed answers about classified prisoners. "The kind that makes her a threat to galactic security," Warden Hayes replied curtly. "Your job is surveillance and containment, Morrison. Leave the background investigation to intelligence services." Jake made his way through the facility's maze of corridors, each checkpoint requiring biometric verification and weapon inspection before allowing access to the next security level. Block 7 housed the most dangerous political prisoners, individuals whose crimes carried implications beyond simple criminal activity. Cell 847 was located at the end of a corridor lined with energy barriers and monitoring stations, isolated from other prisoners by protocols that prevented any communication or coordination between high-risk detainees. Through the observation window, Jake got his first look at the woman he would be guarding for the foreseeable future. She was younger than he'd expected based on the severity of her alleged crimes, with the luminescent skin and pointed ears that marked her as Altarian. Her dark hair was shorter than typical for her species, possibly cut during processing, and she wore the standard detention uniform that did nothing to disguise her obvious exhaustion and the signs of rough treatment during transport. But it was her eyes that caught Jake's attention, golden irises that seemed to hold depths of intelligence and sadness that didn't match her supposed background as a terrorist. When she looked up at the observation window, those eyes met his with an intensity that made him feel like she was searching for something specific in his face. Subject 847, Jake announced through the cell's communication system, following standard protocol for initial contact. "I'm Sergeant Morrison. I'll be your assigned guard for this shift." She tilted her head slightly, studying him through the energy barrier that separated them. "Sergeant Morrison," she repeated, her accented standard carrying a tone that seemed almost hopeful. "Have you been assigned to this facility long?" The question was innocuous enough, but something about the way she asked it made Jake pause. Most prisoners either ignored their guards completely or treated them with open hostility. This one seemed genuinely curious about him as an individual rather than simply as another obstacle to freedom. "Long enough," Jake replied, maintaining the professional distance that facility regulations required. "Do you need anything? Medical attention, food, water?" "I'm fine," she said quietly, but she continued to watch him with that same searching expression. "Sergeant Morrison, may I ask where you served before this assignment?" Jake felt a flicker of unease at the personal nature of her question. "That's not information I'm authorized to share with prisoners." She nodded as if she'd expected that response, but her disappointment was visible even through the energy barrier. "Of course. I understand." As Jake settled into his monitoring station, he found himself studying the prisoner's behavior patterns. She didn't pace her cell like most newly arrived detainees, didn't test the energy barriers or search for weaknesses in her containment. Instead, she sat quietly on her cot, occasionally glancing toward the observation window with an expression that seemed almost familiar. The thought unsettled Jake because he was certain he'd never encountered this woman before. His military records were comprehensive, and he would have remembered meeting an Altarian civilian during his previous assignments. Yet something about her mannerisms, her way of tilting her head when thinking, the rhythm of her speech, all of it triggered a sense of recognition that he couldn't place. Subject 847, he said through the comm system during his evening check, "Have we met before?" The question surprised him as much as it did her. He hadn't intended to ask it, but the nagging sense of familiarity had been growing stronger throughout his shift. She looked up at him with sudden intensity, her luminescent skin brightening noticeably. "You don't remember me, do you?" she said softly, and there was such sadness in her voice that Jake felt something twist in his chest. "Remember you from where?" Jake asked, though part of him was afraid of the answer. But she had already turned away, settling back onto her cot with the kind of resignation that suggested she'd been hoping for recognition that hadn't come. "It doesn't matter," she said quietly. "It was a long time ago, and I suppose I look different now." Jake stared at her through the observation window, his mind racing through memories and assignments, trying to place where he might have encountered an Altarian woman who clearly remembered him far better than he remembered her. The possibility that he'd simply forgotten someone who had obviously meant something to him was more disturbing than any security threat she might represent. As his shift ended and he prepared to transfer monitoring duties to the night guard, Jake found himself reluctant to leave. The prisoner, Subject 847, he corrected himself, had settled into apparent sleep, but even unconscious she seemed somehow familiar. "Trouble with the new arrival?" asked Corporal Davis, Jake's replacement for the night shift. "No trouble," Jake replied, though that wasn't entirely true. "She's different from what I expected." "Different how?" Jake studied the sleeping form through the observation window, trying to articulate his unease. "She acts like she knows me. Like we've met before." Davis laughed. "Morrison, you've been doing this job too long if you're starting to think prisoners are old friends. These people will say anything to get inside your head." Jake nodded and completed the shift transfer, but as he made his way back to his quarters, he couldn't shake the feeling that Davis was wrong. The woman in cell 847 wasn't trying to manipulate him, she was genuinely disappointed that he didn't remember her. The question was, remember her from where? And why did her sadness affect him so much more than it should have? Jake's dreams that night were vivid and fragmented, filled with images that felt like memories but couldn't quite be real. He was in a field hospital, treating wounded civilians while explosions shook the temporary medical facility. An Altarian girl, barely more than a teenager, lay on a treatment table with severe injuries from a bombing attack. Her golden eyes looked up at him with desperate trust as he worked to save her life, speaking to her in broken Altarian phrases he'd learned to calm frightened patients. He woke with a start, his heart racing and his mind trying to grasp details that seemed to slip away the moment he focused on them. The dreams had felt too real to dismiss, but his medical records from the Altarian border conflicts were incomplete due to the chaos of that period and the destruction of several field hospitals. During his next shift, Jake found himself studying Subject 847 with new intensity, searching for any details that might confirm or deny the half-remembered images from his dreams. She seemed to sense his scrutiny, looking up from the book she'd been reading with an expression that was both hopeful and guarded. "Sergeant Morrison," she said through the comm system, "may I ask you something?" Jake hesitated, knowing that personal conversations with prisoners violated multiple regulations. But his curiosity about his fragmented memories overrode his professional caution. "What do you want to know?" "During your military service, did you ever work as a medic?" The question hit Jake like a physical blow because it was so specific to the images that had been haunting his dreams. "How could you possibly know that?" Subject 847's luminescent skin brightened noticeably, and her smile was radiant despite their circumstances. "Because you saved my life 3 years ago at a civilian medical facility on Kepler Prime. You told me your name was Jake Morrison, and you promised me I would be all right." Jake stared at her, his mind racing through implications and possibilities. "That's impossible. I would remember treating an Altarian civilian." "You treated 17 civilians that day," she replied quietly. "I was just one of many casualties from the bombing." But you were the one who refused to let me die when everyone else said my injuries were too severe. As she spoke, more details began flooding back, not complete memories, but fragments that seemed to fit together like pieces of a puzzle he'd been trying to solve. The field hospital on Kepler Prime. The bombing that had nearly destroyed the facility. The desperate hours of treating casualties with inadequate supplies and no hope of evacuation. Lyra Say, Jake said suddenly, the name emerging from some buried corner of his memory. Your name was Lyra Say. Her smile was brilliant. You do remember. Jake felt the ground shift beneath his understanding of his current situation. But your file says you're a saboteur. A terrorist responsible for attacks on human installations. My file says many things that aren't true, Lyra Say replied sadly. After you saved my life, I dedicated myself to helping other war refugees, both human and Eltarian. I worked with underground networks that evacuated civilians from combat zones and provided medical aid to anyone who needed it. Then how did you end up here? Lyra Say's expression grew grim. Because I was searching for you. For 3 years, I've been trying to find the human medic who saved my life on Kepler Prime. I joined humanitarian organizations that worked with human refugees, hoping someone would know Jake Morrison who had served as a combat medic. Jake felt sick as he began to understand the implications. And military intelligence interpreted your inquiries as espionage. They decided that an Eltarian asking detailed questions about human military personnel must be gathering intelligence for enemy forces, Lyra Say confirmed. When they arrested me, I tried to explain that I was looking for someone who had saved my life, but they classified me as a terrorist operative conducting reconnaissance. So you're here because you were trying to find me to thank me? Jake asked, the irony so bitter it was almost unbearable. I'm here because I wanted to tell the person who gave me back my life that his compassion inspired me to spend that life helping others, Lyra Say said softly. And because I wanted him to know that sometimes the people we save go on to save others. Jake stood up and began pacing his monitoring station, trying to process the moral complexity of his situation. He was now guarding someone whose life he had once risked his own to save, someone who had been imprisoned for the crime of trying to express gratitude to him. Lyra Say, he said finally, what you're telling me, if it's true, then you're not a terrorist. You're a humanitarian who got caught in a military bureaucracy that sees threats everywhere. I am exactly who I was 3 years ago when you saved my life, she replied. Someone who believes that all sentient beings deserve compassion regardless of their species or political affiliations. But the charges against you, sabotage, attacks on military installations, are based on my association with refugee networks that sometimes operated in contested territories, Lyra Say explained. We provided medical aid and evacuation services to anyone who needed them, including deserters from both sides of the conflict. Military intelligence classified this as providing aid and comfort to enemy forces. Jake realized that his fragmented memories from the border conflicts were becoming clearer as their conversation continued. He remembered the chaos of treating civilians caught in military crossfire, the impossible decisions about who to save when resources were limited, and the dedication of people like Lyra Say who risked everything to help strangers. I remember now, he said quietly. You were barely conscious when we evacuated you, but you kept asking about other casualties. Even while you were dying, you were worried about whether we had enough medical supplies to treat everyone. And you told me that good people always worry about others, even when they should be worried about themselves, Lyra Say replied. That's when I knew you were someone special. But I forgot you, Jake said, guilt settling in his chest like a physical weight. I saved your life, and then I forgot you existed. You saved 17 people that day, Lyra Say said gently. You couldn't possibly remember every face, every story. But I remembered you because you were the difference between life and death for me. Jake looked at her through the energy barrier, seeing past the prisoner designation to the young woman who had spent 3 years trying to find him, only to end up imprisoned for the crime of gratitude. Lyra Say, he said carefully, what's going to happen to you? What are they planning? Her expression grew somber. Transfer to a classified facility for enhanced interrogation. They believe I have information about refugee networks that could be useful for intelligence purposes. Jake felt cold understanding wash over him. Enhanced interrogation was a euphemism for torture, and facilities that handled such cases rarely returned their subjects alive. When? He asked. Soon, Lyra Say replied quietly. Perhaps within days. Jake stared at her, realizing that the woman whose life he had once saved was now going to die because of a system he had sworn to serve. The irony was devastating, but more than that, it was a betrayal of everything he thought he had been fighting for during his military service. Lyra Say, he said softly, I'm going to find a way to help you. I don't know how, but I'm not going to let this happen. Jake, she said, using his first name for the first time since their reunion, you can't risk your career for me. You've already done enough. No, Jake replied firmly, I haven't done nearly enough. And I'm not going to lose you twice. The next several days passed in a haze of planning and moral reckoning as Jake wrestled with the decision to help Lyra Say escape. During his off-duty hours, he researched her case through military databases, using his security clearance to access files that painted a picture completely different from the terrorist narrative in her official charges. Lyra Say had indeed worked with refugee networks, but her activities involved medical aid and civilian evacuation rather than military sabotage. The attacks on human installations mentioned in her file turned out to be rescues of wounded soldiers from both sides of the conflict, actions that had saved human lives rather than endangered them. She's scheduled for transfer tomorrow, Jake told himself during another sleepless night, staring at classified orders that would send Lyra Say to a black site facility where she would disappear forever. If I'm going to act, it has to be now. The plan he developed was desperate and almost certainly suicidal from a career perspective, but Jake could no longer reconcile his military service with allowing the execution of someone whose only crime had been trying to thank him for saving her life. Lyra Say, he said during what he knew would be their last normal conversation, I need you to trust me one more time. She looked up from the datapad she'd been reading, her golden eyes holding the same trust he remembered from 3 years earlier. What do you need me to do? During the shift change tonight, there's going to be a brief window when the monitoring systems cycle through their security updates, Jake explained, speaking quietly to avoid detection by surveillance equipment. When that happens, I'm going to override your cell's containment fields. Jake, if you help me escape, they'll court-martial you, Lyra Say protested. You'll lose everything you've built in your military career. I've been thinking about that, Jake replied honestly. And I've realized that a career built on imprisoning innocent people isn't worth preserving. But you're a good soldier. You serve with honor. Jake laughed bitterly. Honor? Lyra Say, I'm guarding someone whose life I once considered worth risking my own to save. How is that honorable? You're following orders. I'm following orders that contradict everything I thought I believed about justice and protecting innocent people, Jake interrupted. You know what I realized when I remembered saving your life? That was the last time I felt like my military service actually meant something. Lyra Say moved closer to the energy barrier, her expression showing the kind of concern that transcended their prisoner-guard relationship. Jake, are you sure about this? Once you help me escape, there's no going back. I'm sure, Jake replied without hesitation. The only thing I'm not sure about is where we go from here. Jake met her eyes directly, seeing his own determination reflected in her golden gaze. Lyra Say, 3 years ago I saved your life and then forgot about you. I'm not making that mistake again. The escape itself went more smoothly than Jake had dared hope. The facility's security systems were designed to prevent breakouts by prisoners, not break-ins by guards with legitimate access codes. Jake's knowledge of shift rotations and monitoring protocols allowed him to move Lyra Say through the complex during a window when surveillance would record nothing more than routine guard activities. Transport Bay 7, Jake whispered as they moved through darkened corridors toward the facility's vehicle depot. I've programmed a shuttle for automatic departure to the neutral zone. Once you're there, you can claim asylum with human refugee organizations. What about you? Lyra Say asked as they reached the transport bay. I'll create a diversion to cover your escape, Jake replied, though they both knew he was essentially volunteering to be arrested as an accomplice. Don't worry about me, just get to safety. Lyra Say stopped walking and turned to face him directly. Jake Morrison, 3 years ago you saved my life by refusing to let me face death alone. I'm not going to let you face imprisonment alone now. You don't have a choice, Jake protested. If you stay, we both get captured. And if I leave, you get captured anyway, Lyra Say pointed out. But if we leave together, we both have a chance. Jake stared at her, processing the implications of what she was suggesting. You're asking me to desert my post, abandon my military career, and become a fugitive. I'm asking you to remember what you told me 3 years ago, Lyra Say replied softly. That good people always worry about others, even when they should be worried about themselves. The decision that followed would define the rest of Jake's life. Looking at Lyra Say, seeing the trust and hope in her expression, he realized that everything important about his identity was tied not to his military rank or career prospects, but to his willingness to help people who needed protection. All right, he said, adjusting their escape route to include both of them. But once we're off this station, we're going to have to figure out how to build new lives as civilian refugees. Together? Lyra Say asked with a smile that lit up the darkened transport bay. Together, Jake confirmed, taking her hand as they boarded the shuttle that would carry them away from everything familiar toward an uncertain but shared future. As the shuttle launched into space, leaving detention facility Omega 7 behind, Jake felt a strange sense of completion rather than loss. For the first time since the border conflicts, he was acting in accordance with his deepest values rather than following orders that contradicted them. Jake, Lyra Say said as they watched the stars stream past the shuttle's viewport, what you're doing for me, giving up your career, your security, everything you've built. Is what you would have done for me, Jake replied, understanding that their relationship had evolved far beyond gratitude or obligation. Lyra Say, 3 years ago I saved your life because it was the right thing to do. Today, you're saving mine by giving me a chance to remember who I actually am. And who is that? Jake looked at her, seeing past the former prisoner to the remarkable woman who had spent 3 years trying to find him, only to end up saving him in ways she probably didn't even understand. Someone who believes that protecting innocent people is more important than protecting institutions, he said quietly. Someone who thinks that the connections we make with others are what give life meaning. Someone who's ready to build something new with a person who understands what it means to fight for what's right. Lyra Say's luminescent skin glowed with warmth and happiness. That sounds like the Jake Morrison I remember from Kepler Prime. That sounds like the man I want to be again, Jake replied, taking her hand and feeling the rightness of their partnership in ways that transcended romance or even friendship. They were flying toward an uncertain future as fugitives from the system that had brought them together, but Jake had never felt more certain about a decision in his life. Some connections, he realized, were worth any sacrifice required to preserve them. The pursuit began within hours of their escape, as military forces mobilized to recapture what official reports would describe as a dangerous terrorist and her military accomplice. But Jake's knowledge of military search protocols and Lyra Say's understanding of refugee networks allowed them to stay ahead of their pursuers while making their way toward the neutral territories where asylum might be possible. They'll be monitoring all official transportation hubs, Jake said as they transferred from their stolen shuttle to a civilian cargo hauler whose captain asked no questions about passengers willing to pay in untraceable credits. But the refugee networks you worked with, do they have safe routes through contested space? Lyra Say was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing the risks of involving her former colleagues in their escape. There are people who might help us, but contacting them puts their operations at risk. If military intelligence traces our communication, then a lot of innocent people get arrested for helping refugees, Jake finished grimly. So we do this on our own. What followed was the most intense week of Jake's life as they navigated through systems controlled by various factions, avoiding military patrols while trying to reach human-controlled space where Lyra Say could claim political asylum. Their forced partnership under extreme stress revealed depths of compatibility that surprised them both. Jake's tactical training complemented Lyrasay's knowledge of civilian networks, while her telepathic abilities provided early warning of hostile forces that conventional sensors couldn't detect. There, Lyrasay said during one particularly close encounter with a military patrol, 3 ships moving to intercept our flight path. But their emotional signatures suggest routine patrol rather than targeted pursuit. Can you sense their intentions? Jake asked, adjusting their course to avoid the patrol while maintaining cover among normal shipping traffic. Boredom, mostly, Lyrasay replied with a slight smile. And irritation about being assigned to what they consider pointless border patrol duty. Good thing they don't know what they're missing, Jake observed, watching the patrol ships pass their position without detecting the fugitives hidden among legitimate cargo transports. Their conversations during long hours of travel revealed how much their lives had been shaped by their brief encounter 3 years earlier. Lyrasay spoke of the inspiration she'd drawn from Jake's compassion during her rescue, how it had influenced her decision to dedicate her life to helping other refugees. After you saved me, I couldn't stop thinking about what you said, that good people worry about others even when they should worry about themselves, she told him during one of their rest stops at a remote supply station. It made me realize that survival isn't enough. That the purpose of surviving is to help others do the same. And that's what led you to work with refugee networks, Jake said, understanding how his forgotten words had shaped her entire adult life. It's what led me to you, Lyrasay corrected softly. Everything I did for the past 3 years was motivated by the need to find the person who had shown me what real compassion looked like. Jake felt the weight of responsibility and connection that went far beyond romance or even friendship. Lyrasay, when I saved your life on Kepler Prime, I was just doing what seemed right in the moment. I had no idea it would affect you so profoundly. That's what made it so powerful, she replied. You didn't save me because you expected gratitude or recognition. You saved me because you couldn't bear to let someone die when you had the ability to prevent it. Their journey finally ended at Sanctuary Station, a neutral facility that processed asylum requests from refugees fleeing various conflicts throughout the galaxy. The process of applying for political protection required Jake to formally renounce his military commission and accept designation as a deserter, while Lyrasay had to provide detailed testimony about the circumstances of her imprisonment. Are you sure about this? The asylum coordinator asked Jake during his final interview. Renouncing military citizenship is irreversible. You'll never be able to return to human military service. Jake looked through the interview room's window at Lyrasay, who was completing her own paperwork in an adjacent office. I'm sure. My military service was supposed to be about protecting innocent people. If the system prevents me from doing that, then the system isn't worth serving. And your relationship with the Altarian refugee, that's not influencing your decision. My relationship with Lyrasay is the result of my decision, not the cause, Jake replied honestly. 3 years ago, I saved her life because it was the right thing to do. Today, I'm choosing to build a life with her for the same reason. The asylum process took several weeks, during which Jake and Lyrasay lived in temporary housing while their cases were evaluated. The forced proximity and shared uncertainty deepened their connection in ways that surprised them both. They were learning to be together not as rescuer and rescued, or guard and prisoner, but as equals choosing to build something new together. Jake, Lyrasay said during one of their evening walks through the station's residential district, what do you want to do once our asylum is approved? You've given up everything familiar for my sake. Not for your sake, Jake corrected gently. For our sake. Lyrasay, what we have isn't about obligation or gratitude. It's about recognizing someone who shares your values and choosing to face the future together. But what kind of future? We're both refugees now, starting over with nothing but each other. Jake stopped walking and turned to face her, taking her hands in his and marveling at how perfectly they fit together despite coming from different worlds. Nothing but each other, and the knowledge that we make each other stronger. Lyrasay, you've spent 3 years helping refugees because I showed you compassion once. I've thrown away my entire military career because you reminded me what that compassion was supposed to accomplish. So what do we do with that? We keep doing what we've always done, Jake said with growing certainty. We help people who need help. I'm still a medic, you're still someone who understands how to navigate refugee networks. Maybe we can do more good as civilians than we ever could within military or political systems. Lyrase's luminescent skin brightened with hope and excitement. A medical clinic for refugees? People fleeing conflicts who can't access traditional healthcare. Exactly, Jake replied, seeing the same vision taking shape in her mind. We use my medical training and your understanding of refugee communities to provide care for people who fall through the cracks of official aid systems. Jake Morrison, Lyrase said with a smile that lit up the entire corridor, you continue to save lives in the most unexpected ways. 6 months later, the Morrison-Lyrase Medical Collective opened its doors in the neutral zone, providing free healthcare to refugees from across the galaxy. The facility operated on donations and volunteer labor, staffed by former military medics and civilian doctors who shared Jake and Lyrase's commitment to treating anyone who needed care regardless of their species, political affiliation, or ability to pay. Patient in Bay 3 is a human deserter with plasma burns, reported Dr. Sarah Kim, who had left her own military position to join their clinic. Says he was wounded helping evacuate civilians from a combat zone. I'll take him, Jake said, grabbing his medical kit and noting with satisfaction that he felt none of the moral ambiguity that had plagued his final years of military service. Here, every patient was someone who genuinely needed help, and every treatment was an unambiguous good. The clinic had become more than just a medical facility, it was a proof of concept that people from different backgrounds could work together to solve problems that governments and militaries seemed unable to address. Jake and Lyrase's partnership had evolved into something that enhanced both their professional effectiveness and their personal happiness. Dr. Morrison, called one of their Altarian volunteers, we have a new arrival who specifically requested to see you. Says you treated her sister 3 years ago on Kepler Prime. Jake looked up from the inventory reports he'd been reviewing, feeling the familiar warmth that came from learning his work had created ripple effects he'd never anticipated. Send her to consultation room 2. I'll be right there. As he walked toward the patient consultation area, Jake reflected on how much his life had changed since that night when Lyrase had whispered his name in a detention cell. The woman he'd forgotten had become the center of his existence, while the career he'd thought defined him had been replaced by work that felt more meaningful than anything he'd done in uniform. Jake, Lyrase said, appearing at his side with the kind of perfect timing that had characterized their partnership since their escape, the new patient, her emotional signature suggests profound gratitude mixed with desperation. I think you're about to meet another person whose life you've affected in ways you don't remember. Then we'd better make sure we help her, Jake replied, taking Lyrase's hand as they walked together toward another opportunity to prove that compassion could transcend any barrier the universe created. Together? Lyrase asked with the same hope that had colored her voice during their escape from Omega 7. Always together, Jake confirmed, understanding that their love story was really about something larger than romance. It was about the power of connection to transform not just individuals, but entire communities of people who had lost hope. Their clinic treated dozens of patients every day, each one a reminder that small acts of kindness could create changes that echoed across years and systems. Jake had learned to save lives without needing to remember every face, while Lyrase had found the person she'd been searching for and discovered that he was exactly who she'd hoped he would be. Together, they had built something that honored both their past and their future. A place where the values that had brought them together could flourish without the constraints of military hierarchies or political boundaries. Dr. Morrison, the new patient said when Jake entered the consultation room, my sister told me that you saved her life when everyone else said she was too badly injured to help. I'm here because I need someone who sees people rather than problems. Jake smiled, settling into his chair and preparing to listen to another story of human struggle and resilience. That's what we're here for, he said simply. Tell me how we can help. As he began another medical consultation with Lyrace supporting him both professionally and personally, Jake realized that their love story had become something even more beautiful than he'd imagined. A demonstration that the connections we make with others can save not just individual lives, but entire ways of understanding what it means to care for each other across every difference that might otherwise keep us apart.